Welcome to Ratio Dialogue International. My name is Lotta Stan, and I'm here with David Autor. He is the Heckscher-lecture-recipient for 2020, really, but he's here in 2021 due to the pandemic. So, David, you're the Ford Professor of Economics at MIT, and tonight you're going to give a lecture on the persistence of the China shock. What is the China shock?
Great. Well, first, thank you very much. I'm honored to be here, and I'm looking forward to tonight's lecture. The China shock is a term that's come to refer to the impact of China's dramatic rise as a manufacturing exporter on the economies of industrialized countries. And particularly, my focus has been on the United States. But just by way of context, China went from an extremely poor, economically backward country under communist rule, under Mao Zedong, and it began a process of reform and opening in the 1980s under Deng Xiaoping. And as it opened to Western technology, to use of prices, to foreign direct investment, and to internal migration, mostly from people from kind of low productivity rural areas, agricultural areas, into the coastal special economic zones. It began a process of transformation that is almost unprecedented in kind of modern history. Its rate of productivity growth was spectacular. It quickly went from really having nothing to export but commodities to first moving into labor-intensive manufacturing, serving as a kind of a workshop for the rest of the world, and then moved up the value chain and is now a middle-income country, has very high productivity in many technical sectors and extremely advanced. And China's rise, catapulted, several hundred million people in China out of abject poverty and really built the world's middle class. Including bringing prosperity not just to China, but to sub-Saharan Africa through investment to some degree, creating commodity booms in Central and South America. So it's really a spectacular event in human history, and in many ways kind of the best thing that's happened to world economic prosperity in centuries.
Sure.
So the term China shock should not be viewed as taking away from that spectacular human achievement. It's a specific manifestation of a much, much larger phenomenon. But from the perspective of, I think from the perspective of many traditional trade economists and people studying industrialized country labor markets, China's rise provided a unusual setting for understanding how changes in trading conditions potentially affect domestic labor markets. And China, as it became an extremely large exporter, it displaced a lot of exports from some other competing countries, the United States being one of the countries that had the largest degree of export displacement. And really, or manufacturing displacement, a lot of what it displaced in the United States was actually goods that the U.S. produced for itself. Things that, all large countries actually produce a lot for themselves.
Sure.
U.S. is no exception to that. It's not by world standards. Sweden is a much more open economy than the U.S. in terms of trade as a share of GDP, and so it caused very rapid contractions in certain subsectors of manufacturing that were very labor intensive. So, textiles, furniture, dolls and toys, assembly, a lot of construction products. And so it gave us an opportunity to learn about how these trade-induced contractions affect earnings, employment, the adjustment process. And the notion that there would be an adjustment is fully anticipated by trade theory. So, speaking of Eli Heckscher, the Heckscher-Ohlin model of trade would tell us that, you would reallocate production across sectors in response to changes in competitive conditions in terms of the terms of trade or the degree of comparative advantage in some set of sectors. And so as China gained comparative advantage in labor-intensive manufacturing, the U.S. lost comparative advantage
Sure.
in those areas. And it happened very rapidly by the standards of these things, partly because China is such a large country. It at present produces about 20% of all of the world's manufactured exports, up from essentially 0% in the early 1980s. Even around 1990, it was a quarter of a percentage point. So you would anticipate that this would occur, and important to state that manufacturing is at most 15% of U.S. employment.
Yeah.
It's not huge. However, one thing is manufacturing jobs are relatively well paid on the scale of jobs for people without high levels of education. And the other thing is manufacturing is extremely geographically concentrated, meaning that it's unlike grocery stores and pharmacies and gas stations. It's not uniformly distributed across space.
Sure.
Manufacturing areas have much higher manufacturing employment than the typical area. And more than that, they're very specialized in a few things. So it's not like a manufacturing intensive area. It makes a little bit of cars, a little bit of airplanes, a little bit of furniture, a little bit of dolls, right? Places specialize in furniture, in textiles, in automotive. And so, and a change in the terms of trade like that has extremely geographically concentrated impacts, right? It's not just a little bit everywhere. From the consumer's perspective, it's a little bit everywhere, right? Prices are lower in Walmart, but from the perspective of workers and producers, it's a very concentrated impact.
It hits certain areas really hard.
Exactly.
Yeah, sure.
So this offered an opportunity for understanding what they did. And I've done a lot of work with my co-authors, Gordon Hansen of the Harvard Kennedy School and David Dorn of the University of Zurich, and many other people working on this question. And what we found is, first, of course, large manufacturing contractions. That would sort of have to be true.
Yeah.
But the surprising thing is how poorly the labor market adaptation process unfolded. That when those contractions occurred, in the best case scenario, which is the sort of scenario that was envisioned by Eli Heckscher, in a kind of a frictionless labor market, people rapidly transition across sectors. There's no geographic friction, so people move across space. So it's imagine if you threw a rock into a pond, right? And first there's a splash and some waves, but a little while later, it's undetectable because it's distributed everywhere. But imagine instead that the pond was ice, and you threw a rock into the pond and you just made a hole in the ice, right?
Sure.
So the first scenario is the one that traditional theory would kind of get you to envision. But the data are much more consistent with the latter, that these shocks really persisted in the sense that we saw falls in manufacturing employment, but equally large falls in employment to population, and eventually people leaving the labor force, large increases in payment of transfer benefits. Now, that may not be that surprising from a Swedish perspective, but the U.S. has a fairly ungenerous social safety net.
Yeah.
And most of the benefits that people receive were actually not work-related benefits, but things associated with leaving labor force.
So let us sort of get into there. So
Okay.
why do you think that the Heckscher-Ohlin theory is wrong, or has somehow the context changed, or is it something about the scale of this shock that made it different from the Detroit Japanese competition? Sort of also had a very large impact on the U.S.
That's right.
manufacturing industry. But is it different this time, you would say?
Let me give you, I think it's a sort of two-part answer.
Sure.
So one, the theory is not wrong per se. It's just
Inertia, or
no. It's that it sort of abstracts from a lot of things that are realistic. But that's true of all theories.
that sounds
right?
like wrong.
No. Okay. Let me try it again. All theory is an abstraction, right?
Sure,
It's a simplification of the world,
Yeah.
right? And the fundamental ideas in the Heckscher-Ohlin theory about comparative advantage and about not how it causes you to where it causes you to specialize. That's correct. And what's kind of not present in that, and in most models, is a kind of frictional adjustment process, right? Where factors don't immediately reallocate to their best and highest
I
use.
do think that I think that wouldn't be surprising to anyone,
No.
that it wouldn't be frictionless. But you're sort of saying that it's not just that it takes a year or two for
Right.
people to readjust and find new employment or move or whatever.
Right.
They actually stay, and it's a much longer kind of
That's right.
persistent than that. And I think that's different, right? Because of course we think, anyone who knows about the labor market understands that
Right.
things don't change immediately, but
That's right.
you kind of think the ripple effect
That's
it takes a little time, and then
Yes. So that sort of brings me to the second part of the answer is, has something uniquely gone wrong, right? Or is it something about the shock, or is in fact things were always we underappreciated how difficult they were?
Sure.
And I don't think I have a definitive answer to that. I mean, we've looked at different cases, and in general, you do find when there are big declines of kind of central sectors of an area, that it does lead to long-term hardship, whether, it's coal mining areas in the United States, whether it's, the city of Detroit, big auto center, lost half of its population between the 1970s and the present, as, and house values basically, became zero or negative. So I think that and there are many reasons why that would be true, why people don't just want to pick up and go. It's challenging. They don't have the resources to go elsewhere. They have family. It's actually when places go into decline because real estate prices are so low, it's actually cheap places to live.
oh,
Housing, the housing stock is still there, right? Even if no one,
sure, even if it's not worth much
exactly.
on the market,
So it's still
worth,
useful.
yeah,
Exactly.
sure.
So we don't know for sure. It is the case that in the U.S. there's less geographic mobility than there used to be. We don't really know why people don't tend to pick up and move even as much as they used to 20 years ago. But I think the broader lesson, that I would take away is that in general, when people have thought about trade adjustment, they've been excessively positive about the benefits and excessively dismissive of the costs. And the benefits actually, at least in kind of, conventional economic models, are actually not that large. Now, they're not negligible. They're important. I don't think we should forgo them. But the gain to U.S. consumer purchasing power, is in the order of a couple percentage points.
Sure, but think about China.
Sure.
It's like for the U.S. it might not be a lot, but for the people in China, it has been a tremendous,
Of course,
tremendous
and that's where I started.
evolution.
Right.
Yeah, I know. I'm not saying you're wrong.
Yeah.
I just want to remind people.
That's right, absolutely. But of course, when voters are making policy, they're generally not
thinking about China,
taking world welfare into account.
I hear you.
And so, and of course, it matters who is affected as well.
Sure.
Right. So it is not the case that China trade shock took people who were super rich and made them slightly less rich. Right. It took people who were, not highly educated, didn't have the best outside options, but were in relatively secure, relatively highly paid jobs, and made them less secure without better options.
Sure. So let me ask you to speculate a little bit. I think of manufacturing as a male-dominated area of labor. Is that true of the displaced jobs
Overall,
in
manufacturing has a higher ratio of men to women than the kind of aggregate economy. But in a lot of labor-intensive manufacturing, in textiles and assembly, for example, there's a lot of women.
Yeah.
So we find actually the kind of employment consequences as a share of employment for women and men in manufacturing were relatively comparable.
Okay.
Now, the outcomes were different.
Yeah. Okay.
Men were less likely to rejoin the labor force.
That's kind of my hypothesis here is that there's something about men and geography. I'm speculating now, but I do think that there is something interesting we see this very up north in sort of these areas of Sweden that are very, very thinly populated,
Right.
where a lot of people leave, but those who stay are often men.
Right.
And I'm kind of curious if you have an idea of why this is. Do men have a stronger attachment to place? This is not an economist question, perhaps, but I do think it's kind of interesting.
I would say two things. I think the economy in most industrialized countries have changed in a way that's not as favorable for men in traditional jobs. And so, still for highly educated people of both sexes
Sure.
or all genders, there's great opportunity in professional work, technical work, managerial work, in law and medicine,
Sure.
in academia. But for people without high levels of education, the world has changed. There's many fewer hands-on, physically intensive jobs, in production jobs, in transportation,
Sure.
material moving, cleaning. Sorry, not cleaning. I take that back. Not
Yeah.
cleaning. And there's a lot more for people without high levels of education. Again, there's many more service jobs, in-person service jobs. Food service, entertainment, recreation, hospitality.
Sure.
And a lot more kind of service, cleaning, security, janitorial work.
Yeah.
And I would say the work in general has lower status. It's less specialized, so it doesn't have the same earnings power, and it may not play to the traditional tastes of men, right? So I think, and again, I'm speculating, and this is painting with a broad brush. There's lots of exceptions to this,
Sure.
but
Yeah,
I think there are many people, but probably more of the men who would say, for the same rate of pay, I'd rather do construction than food service. Even you'd have to pay me a lot more to want to do the food service job, or someone.
Mm-hmm.
So we see this, throughout the industrialized world, that male labor force participation rates have, stagnated or fallen.
Yeah.
And that, some of that is, healthy if people who are, later in life and aren't that healthy or, not working, we have the luxury of not doing that. But when you see that among young adults, particularly, it's much more problematic.
Yeah.
And that's something that my co-authors, David Autor and Gordon Hanson, and I have worked on, looking at prime age adults. And when we see these trade shocks, we see differential declines in the employment to population rate of men.
I see.
We see falls in marriage and fertility, a rise in children living in single-headed households, living in poverty, and also an increase in what Ann Case and Angus Deaton have referred to as deaths of despair, meaning deaths having to do with drug overdoses
I see.
and preventable illness.
So, but let me get back to China and
Sure.
Sort of the China shock. And you kind of mentioned a little bit about the size and the scale of just China's export
Yeah.
to the U.S. So is it possible that this was a shock that hit the U.S. so hard because you've never really been exposed to this kind of competition before because of the size of the U.S., I'm thinking?
I mean, in some ways, yes. I mean, let me again, as always, give
Sure.
you two answers. So, I mean, I could give you three. So let me first start with the U.S. and then zoom out
Sure.
a bit. The U.S. among industrialized countries, high income industrialized countries, probably had more low wage employment and more labor intensive. More of that work had left Europe a long time ago.
Yeah.
And that's because the U.S. actually is it's a very unequal country, and we have a lot of low wage employment. So, these were good jobs for the people who did them, but, they were still, U.S. manufacturing workers make much less than German manufacturing workers, for example. So one is, yes, I think the U.S. was relatively highly exposed. But the truth is, actually, if you look across European countries, the job losses were kind of proportionate to the size of the export shock that they experienced. And so the U.S. is not really that much of an outlier. The main thing is the scale of the export change it experienced. Now, and partly that is reflective of what it was doing. But even other countries like Portugal, right? It's not that Portugal imported a lot of Chinese goods, but a lot of goods that it would have exported were preempted,
Sure.
By China. Same with Mexico as well. So, but there's been a lot of work looking at this in Norway, in Portugal, in the UK, in France, and in Germany, and they all produce qualitatively similar answers. The countries that had big import shocks saw contractions in manufacturing employment and had some challenges adjusting. Now, Germany is different because it mostly runs an export surplus
Yeah.
with China, and that has, that has supported a lot of industry, but then actually it has lost employment to Eastern Europe in other
Sure.
parts, and
Yeah.
that has similar effects to the
Sure.
to the
So,
U.S.-China.
I mean, now we're sort of talking about trade as something that is a negative on the economy. Is there any?
No,
Well,
I don't mean to suggest that.
negative. Yeah, I'm just saying
Yeah.
that I think it's also important to bring up sort of the positive side
Sure.
of trade,
Yeah.
especially in these times where people are more and more challenging globalization and sort of saying like, oh, it's not a good idea and we should be self-sufficient and in the spirit of Eli F. Heckscher,
Sure.
it's like trade is a good thing.
Well, I mean, so nothing I've said so far really is inconsistent with Heckscher.
I hear
Right.
you. I'm
Yeah.
not.
No.
I'm not
no,
sort of
I just want to put
accusing
this
you.
in context.
Yeah.
There's not what the Heckscher-Ohlin model would say, and what our research would say, is that trade raises GDP.
Yeah.
It increases national income or income per worker, and it has distributional consequences.
Yeah.
And the Heckscher-Ohlin model would imply, in fact, that people in the effectively the sector that loses comparative advantage would lose earnings, not employment because that's a frictionless model, but they would lose earnings.
Yeah.
So really, what we're talking about is the distributional consequences, not the net gains.
I see.
And the problem is that and this is always true of trade, that you have diffuse beneficiaries and concentrated harms.
Yeah.
Right. So, people don't go to Walmart and go and say, "Oh, my life is so much better because of China." Maybe they should.
Maybe they should, but it's not the way they feel.
Right. Exactly. Whereas people who've lost work, feel very strongly about
Very,
this.
very strong about this.
So, I mean, I think one thing it does really point to in terms of policy is, especially in the United States, we had very flimsy trade adjustment assistance in place. We had some, but it was hard to access. It was small. And there was a kind of a belief among policymakers, which I think was really informed by economists, saying, in theory, there could be costs and benefits, but it's really mostly benefits. Everybody, don't worry about it. Take your medicine. It'll be fine.
Sure.
And they were too sanguine about, how this would work out.
I see.
And people were really, really quite surprised by how concentrated and scarring the effects were.
Yeah. So there's cost and benefits of everything in life. I would love to speak to you for a longer period of time, but I think our time is out. Thank you so much for talking to me today, and I very much look forward to tonight.
Well, thank you very much. I enjoyed the conversation. Thank you very much for having me here.
Thank you.